The sun was a physical weight upon the high desert of Nevada, a relentless, golden anvil that crushed the breath out of the valley long before the clock struck noon. Inside the shaded sanctuary of the Silver Dust Saloon, Maylin moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace that belied the exhaustion simmering beneath her skin. At 40, her beauty had not faded so much as it had distilled, transforming from the soft bloom of youth into the sharp, enduring elegance of a high desert juniper. Her dress was a study in austerity, a plain, charcoal gray cotton that seemed to absorb the shadows of the room, cinched at a waist that had once been held by a husband who now lay beneath 6 feet of alkaline earth. She wiped the scarred surface of the mahogany bar, her movements slow and deliberate, a silent prayer to the routine that had kept her sane through 5 years of widowhood. Why did the heat feel heavier this year? It was a question she asked the empty chairs every afternoon, her internal monologue the only consistent companion in a life defined by the absence of sound. She had come to this territory as a bride of 20, following a dreamer who promised her gold and gave her a graveyard of failed expectations. Now she was the mistress of a quiet empire of spirits and dust, her heart a locked room to which she had long ago thrown away the key. She watched the motes of dust dancing in the singular shafts of light that pierced the shutters, wondering if her own life was merely a collection of such drifting, purposeless particles. The resilience that had carried her through the winters and the lonely nights was beginning to feel less like a virtue and more like a sentence. She was a woman who had reconciled herself to the twilight, believing that the fire of her life had burned down to cold, unmovable embers, leaving her with nothing but the quiet dignity of a survivor. The stillness was shattered not by a sound, but by a shift in the air, a sudden cooling as the heavy swinging doors groaned on their hinges to admit a figure that seemed woven from the very heat haze outside. He stood in the threshold for a moment, a silhouette of frayed edges and road-worn leather, his presence pulling the oxygen from the room. Maylin did not look up immediately. She finished polishing a glass, her hands steady despite the sudden prickle of intuition at the base of her neck. When she finally raised her eyes, she met a gaze that felt like the first breath of autumn after a killing summer. The man was not young, but he possessed a rugged, weathered vitality, his face etched with the topographical maps of 1,000 miles of hard travel. His clothes were caked in the pale silt of the trail, and his eyes, a startling, tired blue, held the look of a man who had seen too much and said too little. He didn't move with the swagger of the gunmen who usually frequented the border towns. There was a heaviness in his shoulders, a profound exhaustion that mirrored the very fatigue Maylin felt in her soul. He approached the bar, the jingle of his spurs a lonely metallic cadence in the cavernous room. He didn't demand attention, nor did he look around with the predatory curiosity of a drifter looking for trouble. Instead, he placed a hand, calloused and stained by rains and gunpowder, gently upon the wood, as if seeking an anchor in a world that had kept him adrift for far too long. He looked at Maylin, and for the first time in a decade, she felt the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen, not as a fixture of the establishment or a relic of a dead man's life, but as a living, breathing woman standing at the edge of her own horizon. Silas took his hat off, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached rye, and a forehead pale where the sun had not reached it. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to settle between them like a shared secret. Maylin reached for a clean glass, her fingers grazing the cool surface as she waited for the standard request for rye or bourbon. Instead, the man spoke in a voice that was deep and resonant, yet held a tremor of vulnerability, like a cello played in a room full of glass. "I find myself wondering," he began, his eyes never leaving hers, "if a man can walk so far that he eventually circles back to the person he was meant to be." Maylin paused, the bottle of whiskey mid-air, the philosophical weight of his words catching her off guard. She poured a measure of the amber liquid, the scent of peat and fire filling the small space between them. Most men who come through those doors are only looking to forget who they are, not find who they were, she replied, her voice steady but infused with a soft, melodic quality that seemed to surprise him. He took a sip of the drink, closing his eyes as the warmth hit his throat, and for a fleeting second, the tension in his jaw relaxed. "My name is Silas," he said. The introduction felt like a peace offering. Mei Lin looked at him, noting the fine lines around his eyes and the way he held his glass, not with the desperation of a drunkard, but with the reverence of a man who hadn't had a kind word or a clean drink in weeks. "I am Mei Lin," she said, the sound of her own name feeling strange and new in her mouth. She realized then that no one had called her by her name in years. She was always the widow, or the China woman, or ma'am. To hear it spoken in her own voice and acknowledged by this stranger was a small tectonic shift in her internal landscape. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, stretching across the floorboards like the fingers of a reaching ghost, Silas stayed. He didn't drink to excess, nor did he attempt the clumsy flirtations she was so accustomed to rebuffing. He spoke of the trail, of the way the stars looked over the Mojave, and of the crushing solitude of a life spent in pursuit of nothing but the next horizon. Mei Lin found herself leaning against the back bar, her usual defensive posture softening as she shared fragments of her own history, the voyage from Canton, the cold winters in the mountains, and the way the silence had slowly become her only friend. "Loneliness is a shadow that follows you even in the dark," Silas observed, his gaze fixed on the flickering light of a kerosene lamp she had just lit. "I've spent 20 years trying to outrun it, only to realize I was carrying the sun that cast the shadow right inside my chest." Mei Lin felt a lump form in her throat, a sudden, sharp ache of recognition. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before she placed it near his on the bar. "I thought if I stayed still enough, the loneliness would stop noticing me," she confessed, the honesty of the statement frightening her. "I made myself a part of the furniture, Silas. I thought that was how you survived being left behind." He turned his hand over, his palm facing upward, an unspoken invitation. The air in the saloon seemed to thicken with the scent of sage and old wood, the typical sounds of the town outside fading into a distant, inconsequential hum. In that moment, the 40 years of her life felt less like a burden and more like a necessary journey to reach this specific point of intersection. The evening brought a cooling breeze that rattled the shutters, but inside the silver dust, a different kind of warmth was beginning to take root. Silas looked at Mei Lin, and the weariness in his eyes seemed to have been replaced by a flickering, uncertain hope. "I didn't come here looking for a reason to stop, Mei Lin," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper against the creaking of the building. "But looking at you, I feel like a man who has finally found the North Star after a lifetime of cloudy nights. Is it possible for a heart to restart when it's already been declared dead?" Mei Lin felt a tear, hot and rebellious, track its way down her cheek, cutting through the powder and the dust of her long-held reserve. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she let it fall, a testament to the thaw that was occurring within her. "I used to think that hope was a luxury for the young," she whispered, her eyes locked onto his. "I thought at 40 the story was already written, the ink dry and the pages turning yellow. But perhaps we are just starting a new chapter, Silas. Perhaps the first half was just the prologue." He reached out then, his fingers brushing the stray hair from her face with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. The touch was electric, a grounding wire for all the static energy of her years of isolation. The gun on his hip and the gray dress she wore were merely the costumes of their past lives. Here, in the dim light of a Nevada evening, they were simply two souls recognizing their own reflection in the other. The silence was no longer a void to be feared, but a space to be filled with the possibility of a future they had both stopped believing in, a future that tasted of rain on dry earth and the promise of a long-delayed spring. The next morning didn't arrive with the usual heavy dread that Mei Lin had grown accustomed to over the long years of her solitude. Instead, the light that crept through the gaps in her shutters seemed softer, less like an intruder and more like an invitation. She dressed in the same gray dress, but she found herself lingering at the small, cracked mirror, smoothing her hair with a care she hadn't felt in a decade. Downstairs, the saloon was cool and smelled of stale beer and old dreams, but when she opened the heavy front doors to let in the morning air, she found Silas already there. He wasn't leaning against the wall in wait, but was instead occupied with a bucket of water and a stiff brush, scrubbing the grime from the front porch. He looked up, his face breaking into a slow, tentative smile that reached his eyes, erasing the shadows that had lived there the night before. "A building this fine shouldn't have to carry the weight of every dusty trail in the territory," he said, his voice a warm hum in the quiet morning. Mei Lin stood in the doorway, her hands folded over her apron, feeling a strange flutter in her chest that she had long ago labeled as a symptom of a dying heart. "You didn't have to do that, Silas," she replied, though the protest was hollow. He set the brush aside and stood, his tall frame casting a long, protective shadow toward her. "I know I didn't," he said softly, walking toward her until the scent of cedar and sun-warmed iron surrounded her. "But I've spent my life taking things, or moving past them before they could take root. I'd like to try giving something back, even if it's just a clean porch." They worked together throughout the morning, a choreographed dance of domesticity that felt as natural as breathing. He moved heavy crates and fixed a loose floorboard that had tripped her for months, while she brewed coffee that tasted of more than just scorched beans. Why had she waited so long to let the world back in? The question echoed through her mind as she watched him, realizing that the walls she had built to keep out the pain had also kept out the light. By the time the afternoon sun reached its zenith, the heat within the silver dust was palpable, yet it no longer felt suffocating. They sat at a small table near the back, away from the glare of the street, sharing a simple meal of bread and dried fruit. The intimacy of the moment was profound, a bridge built of shared silences and the occasional soft clink of a fork. Silas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal, its edges frayed and darkened by sweat and age. He laid it on the table between them, his fingers lingering on the cover as if it held the weight of his entire existence. "I've carried this for 15 years, he whispered, his eyes searching hers for understanding. "Every place I've been, every name I've forgotten, every sunset I watched alone, it's all in here. It was my way of proving I existed when there was no one around to remember me." Mei Lin reached out, her hand covering his, her thumb tracing the rough texture of the leather. She thought of her own internal journal, the one written in the scars of her heart and the gray of her hair. "We all have our ways of keeping score with the world," she said, her voice rich with an empathy that transcended language. "I kept mine in the stillness of this room, thinking that if I didn't change anything, time couldn't take anything else away from me." Silas looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze was almost too much to bear. "I'm tired of being a ghost, Mei Lin," he confessed, the admission raw and trembling. "I'm tired of being a man who only exists in the margins of other people's lives. When I look at you, I see a home I never thought I was allowed to have. Is it too late for a man like me to put down his burdens and just stay?" The vulnerability in his voice was a physical pull, a tide drawing her toward a shore she had thought was lost to the fog. She realized that his fear was her own, the terrifying prospect of being happy after so long spent in the service of sorrow. The evening brought a stillness that was different from the loneliness of the past. It was a pregnant silence, full of the weight of a choice that would redefine them both. Silas stood by the bar, his hand hovering over the heavy gun belt he had worn like a second skin for most of his life. With a deliberate, slow movement, he unbuckled the leather, the weight of the steel and lead hitting the mahogany with a final, resonant thud. He didn't say a word, but the gesture was more eloquent than any speech. He was laying down his past, offering up the only identity he had ever known in exchange for the possibility of a future with her. Mei Lin walked around the bar, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached into a small ceramic jar on the back shelf, pulling out a simple, thin gold band that had belonged to her grandmother. It was a relic of a world she had left behind, a symbol of a lineage that had survived through sheer, stubborn will. She held it out to him, her palm open and trembling. "I've been waiting my whole life for you, Silas," she said, the words a repetition of a truth she had only just discovered. "I didn't know your name or the color of your eyes, but I knew the shape of the hole you would fill in my soul." He took the ring, his large, scarred hand closing around hers, and for a moment the world outside, the dusty streets, the violent history of the territory, the passing of the years, simply ceased to exist. "I've been a man of many regrets," Silas whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. "But staying here with you is the first thing I've done in 20 years that feels like it was ordained by something higher than luck." They stood there in the dimming light, two people who had been broken by the world and had found, in each other, the glue to make themselves whole again. The gray dress she wore no longer felt like a shroud. It felt like a canvas, waiting for the colors of a life shared. As the weeks passed, the summer heat began to mellow into the golden, honeyed light of late August. The Silver Dust Saloon was no longer a tomb. It was a place of quiet, humming life. Silas had taken to the work of the town with a steady, quiet competence, his presence a stabilizing force that the locals had quickly come to respect. He didn't speak of his past, and they didn't ask, sensing that the man he was now was the only one that mattered. Mei Lin felt a transformation within herself that was both terrifying and miraculous. The resignation that had defined her for so long had evaporated, replaced by a fierce, protective hope. She found herself laughing, a sound that was rusty and uncertain at first, but grew into a clear, bright chime that filled the corners of the saloon. They spent their evenings on the porch, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the Sierras, the sky turning into a bruised palette of purple and orange. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked in that day?" Silas asked one evening, his arm draped comfortably around her shoulders. Mei Lin leaned into him, the warmth of his body a constant reassurance. "I think the universe has a way of correcting its own mistakes," she mused, her voice reflective and peaceful. "We were two ships lost in a storm, Silas. It was only a matter of time before we washed up on the same shore. Why should we spend our energy wondering about the if when we have the now?" He squeezed her shoulder, a silent agreement. The symbols of their isolation, the journal, the ring, the empty chairs, had been integrated into a new narrative, one of connection and resilience. They were no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had found in the wreckage of their previous lives. The final days of summer brought a sense of profound fulfillment, a realization that the middle of life was not the end, but a vantage point from which the rest of the journey could be seen with clarity. Mei Lin stood behind the bar one last time before closing for the evening, looking at the room she had once considered her prison. It was now a sanctuary, a place where a weary gunslinger had found peace, and a lonely widow had found her voice. Silas came in from the back, his face no longer etched with the lines of chronic exhaustion, but softened by the ease of a man who knew where he belonged. He took the cloth from her hand and finished the last of the polishing, a small gesture of partnership that never failed to move her. "The stars are out, Mei Lin," he said softly, reaching for her hand. They walked out onto the porch together, the air cool and smelling of distant rain and sagebrush. The vastness of the Nevada sky stretched above them, a glittering canopy of possibilities that no longer felt cold or indifferent. They were 40 and beyond, their youth a distant memory, yet they felt more alive in the quiet of that moment than they ever had in the frantic energy of their earlier years. Was this the peace that people spoke of? The quiet certainty of being exactly where you were supposed to be, with the person you were supposed to be with? Maylin looked at Silas, seeing in his weathered face the map of their shared future, and she knew the answer. The long, lonely walk was over. They had found the North Star, and it had led them home to a place where the shadows no longer followed, but were instead absorbed into the deep, enduring light of a love that had arrived exactly when it was needed most. They stood together in the timeless embrace of the high desert, two souls finally at rest, watching the night unfold with a hope that was as steady as the mountains and as infinite as the stars.